This one shot changed cinema forever. It's from a 12-minute long silent film made in 1903 called The Great Train Robbery, which many regard to be the first Western film ever made. The shot in question is from the very end of the film, after the story is ostensibly finished. The film cuts to a close-up of an outlaw. He's looking straight at you, as if he's hijacked the film. He looks at you for a moment, before calmly raising his gun and blasting you away. Film historian Pamela Hutchinson highlights this scene, stating that it sends a jolt of terror as disconcerting as a hand bursting from a grave. The film set the standard for what would become the Western genre, with a story of crime, pursuit, and retribution. It's as if with those final gunshots, the Western exploded itself into being. The combination of the lawless subject matter alongside what is now archaic but at the time impressive cinematic spectacle was a clear hit, planting the seed for what would become the Western genre. As filmmaking developed and adopted new techniques and became more popular than ever, the Western was with it every step of the way. Cowboys, outlaws and sheriffs were staples of American filmmaking for 50 years or so, until they just dried up. By the late 1970s, their popularity had waned, with audiences no longer looking to the Wild West to get their thrills. By all accounts, the Western had died. There's one scene in particular that I think embodies the ending of the genre, with the self-awareness and thematic dedication that it deserves. It's from the very end of Once Upon a Time in the West, made in 1968, when the embers of the Western genre were about to go cold. In a broad sense, the film is about a typical man with no name teaming up with an outlaw to defend a widow's land from a sadistic hired gun. It has all the tropes you'd expect from a Western, but as the film unfolds, it becomes clear that this is set towards the end of the frontier era, when the world was changing and leaving all the cowboys behind. Throughout the film, we're constantly reminded of how the railway is being built and gradually expanding across the frontier. This serves as a symbol of the arrival of civilization. The once lawless and wild West is now being tamed. The main villain isn't a gruff gang of thugs, but a rich, disabled railway baron. Villains now exert their power through money and influence, rather than being a sharpshooter themselves. And the final scene, this scene that represents the ending of the genre, shows the railway finally arriving at the house that all the characters were fighting over. The lone gunmen that dominated the genre up to this point are dwarfed by the huge army of people working on the railroad. The land has been absorbed into a new, more civilized world. The West had been tamed, and in 1968, the genre as a whole was undergoing a similar process. Once Upon a Time in the West obviously wasn't the last Western ever made, but it released at a time when the genre was beginning to run out of steam, and during the 70s there was a steep decline in the amount of Westerns being made, and by the 80s it was almost extinct. The film serves as one last swan song of the epic, spectacle-filled Western that dominated the cinema for the first 50 years of its life. But what came before Once Upon a Time in the West? How did we go from this to this? After The Great Train Robbery in 1903, Western films gradually became more and more prominent. These started off as silent films depicting stoic gunmen with impressive horse riding, but most were relatively low budget and featured only small deviations from the standard plot. But as time progressed, an increasing number of bigger or epic westerns were being made. From the 20s to the 40s, the genre was growing, and the stories were growing with them. The Big Trail was made in 1930 and it was the first large-scale western to use dialogue in its soundtrack, revolutionising the genre, and it never looked back.
Zeke, did you hear that terrible crash?
Hear it? I seen it.
Yeah?
That was your wagon.
This post-World War I era of westerns can generally be characterised by tales of heroes fighting off savage enemies or defending helpless settlements in the middle of the frontier. But as the Great Depression hit and the ideals of American exceptionalism began to be questioned, the central cowboy began to be mistaken for a criminal. He would have to prove his worthiness, but of course he inevitably did. This is a still from Stagecoach from 1939. It shows the central character Ringo, played by John Wayne, after being discovered stranded in the desert. At first, the characters don't trust him, with the marshal training a gun on him. However, as the film unfolds, Ringo inevitably proves his worth and earns the trust of the marshal. In the era of the Great Depression, the Western hero became more rounded. They gained an edge they didn't have previously. However, ultimately they were still good at heart. They were still clean-shaven, polite, and largely working within the confines of the law. But after World War II, and with America increasingly enforcing its dominion over the world, the cowboy figure gradually became darker. But of course, this didn't happen overnight. This is generally what westerns in the 50s looked like. Their clothes are a pretty accurate reflection of the genre in this time. They're so clean and sanitized. All these guys look like upstanding members of 1950s America. And this is largely how the United States viewed itself during this time. A country with a history it can be proud of, and is now a force for good across the globe. But as time progressed and the American people became more aware of the wars, assassinations and coups the United States were carrying out all over the world, westerns became less sanitized. By the mid to late 60s, this is what the typical cowboy looked like. Their clothes are no longer perfectly washed and ironed, their face is no longer clean shaven. The cowboys of this time are not afraid to work outside the law, and the typical stoic yet polite gunslinger was morphing into a hard-bitten, cold-blooded killer. By the height of the Vietnam protest era, cowboys were anti-heroes as often as they were heroes, with Clint Eastwood embodying the more ruthless cowboy characters. This time saw the rise of spaghetti westerns. Made in southern Europe by mostly Italian directors, these highly stylized and more self-aware films featured actors of all different nationalities. Most of the iconic westerns are from this subgenre, with The Good, the Bad and the Ugly being the most notable example. Once Upon a Time in the West was a spaghetti western, but its depiction of the end of the frontier very much reflected the cinema industry. McCabe and Mrs. Miller was released in 1971, following the story of a gambler opening a brothel in a small mining community. The director Robert Altman describes it as an anti-western, as it subverts many of the typical tropes.
We get them goddamn tents up. Now you get on back to work.
By the 1970s, the standard formula was played out. While spaghetti westerns may have extended its life by a few years, the western had run its course, and it's clear it was only going downwards. This came to fruition in 1980, with the disastrous release of Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate is a 3.5-hour western epic about a sheriff involved in a war against a mercenary hired by rich cattle barons. On release, the film saw significant critical backlash, so much so that United Artists pulled it from theatres almost immediately, and a year later released a much shorter version, which only made $3.5 million against a $44 million budget. It's repeatedly been called the worst film ever made, and some film historians see it as responsible for moving cinema into an entirely new era. Heaven's Gate proved that both audiences and critics are done with westerns. They're not interesting anymore, and they're well past their sell-by date. By the time Ronald Reagan was president, the western was truly dead. The era of revisionism in the 60s and 70s had failed, and a less nuanced form of on-screen patriotism would follow. Reagan himself proudly associated with the pre-Vietnam, clean-cut cowboy image. The civil rights and Vietnam protests had ended, and what followed was a more conservative era that had no room for westerns that challenged the mainstream narrative of American history. Westerns had largely been overtaken by horror and sci-fi. Filmmaking had advanced so that more exciting and unique worlds could be created. A simple frontier was no longer novelty when you could see an entire alien world on the screen. That decades-long journey starting with the Great Train Robbery was over. It has had its swan song in Once Upon a Time in the West, but the 70s saw a steep decline, and the blockbuster boom of the 80s was its final demise in mainstream cinema. But then, this happened.
And the Oscar for the Best Picture of 1992 goes to Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood, who had never given up on the genre, won both Best Director and Best Picture for Unforgiven, which follows a retired gunslinger taking on one last job. After his work in Italy, Eastwood returned to America and directed his own films, many of which were westerns. He revised the genre, keeping the same settings and basic tropes, but viewing them from different perspectives. He kept the genre on life support throughout the 70s and 80s, but by the 90s, it could finally survive on its own. Kevin Costner released Dances with Wolves in 1990 and won Best Picture, and with the success of Unforgiven in 1992, the genre established itself as a serious awards contender. The western had woken up from its coma, but it would never return to the prominence it once had, always remaining on the periphery of the mainstream.
Well, I ain't like that no more, Ned. I ain't no crazy killing fool.
In 2012, Tarantino had this to say about John Ford, perhaps the most influential director in the western genre before the 60s. To say the least, I hate him. Forget about faceless Indians he killed like zombies. It really is people like that who kept alive this idea of Anglo-Saxon humanity compared to everybody else's humanity. Westerns have always reflected how America views its past. So in a time when American history was whitewashed, minimising the role of minorities and the treatment of Native Americans, many of the films very much take a similar racist outlook. However, as the population began to reassess its past, the films too began to drift from their conservative ideals. Westerns act as a key benchmark of how the United States views itself, and in a time when many people seem to be doubling back on the progress made since the 60s, perhaps we need an outlet to explore the past now more than ever. While westerns are still being made and increasingly exploring new perspectives, it's unlikely they'll return to the level of prominence they enjoyed throughout the first half of the 20th century. Has the genre simply grown too stale? Is the frontier inherently not as interesting as the new settings allowed by modern filmmaking? Or has America become all too aware of its past, rendering any western that doesn't address this too uncomfortable for today's audiences?